All right, so we're going to be talking about how evolution actually happens, so the mechanisms. So we know that evolution happens. We have evidence that evolution has happened, which we know is the change over time of organisms. Now we're going to investigate or find out how evolution actually happens. So, mechanisms for change. If there's a change in the gene pool or the change in the type of genes that are available in a population, that can cause evolution. Mutations can also lead to more variability, and it has to affect specifically the gametes in order for those mutations to be passed on. So, with gene flow, if there's a change in the allele frequency or how often a dominant allele or recessive allele is present in a population, it changes due to a chance event that can impact the gene flow. So, for example, if there's a disease outbreak, or if there's geographic isolation where maybe some mainland species were isolated onto an island population, now that is going to affect the gene flow. So how often a dominant or recessive allele is present in that population. So variation is going to provide the material for natural selection to work on. And remember, with natural selection, the environment is determining what traits are best suited, not the individual. So, speciation is one mechanism of evolution, and that can happen through two ways, through geographic isolation and reproductive isolation. In geographic isolation, this is when two populations of the same species become separated by a physical barrier. So, for example, an ocean or a canyon. Over time, they would become two completely different species and they would no longer interbreed, even if they were put into the same location. With reproductive isolation, those are two populations that stop interbreeding because they do not share the same mating rituals or differences that cause them to choose who they mate with. And over time, they'll become different species. So, for example, if you have two different rodents, or maybe let's say a skunk, maybe one species of a skunk prefers to mate in the springtime, while another prefers to mate in the winter. Because they mate during two different time periods of the year, they would never actually mate with each other, and they would eventually become, or they will remain, two different species. So, natural physical barriers include islands, mountains, rivers, lakes, and oceans. And reproductive barriers include different cultures, different mating locations, different mating times, so like the season, different mating rituals. So if a bird prefers to sing a song before mating versus if a bird prefers to dance, they will not recognize each other's mating rituals. So these are just some pictures or some graphics to give you an idea about geographic isolation. It is an actual physical barrier. So isolation leads to a new species. So here's an example as we look at some flies when they mate. Geographic isolation is to physically separate the organisms, but they have to actually stop reproducing with each other to create the new organisms. So geographic isolation by itself is not enough. There are some other things that have to take place after geographic isolation has started. So different environments can create different cultures among the organisms. So let's say that an island was created and we create geographic isolation between a species of fruit flies. So we take some fruit flies from the mainland and we put it on this artificial island. The island is going to support different fruit than the mainland. So mangoes versus bananas. This difference in the fruit can lead to different food preferences of the fruit flies on mainland versus the inland. So over time, it is going to lead to reproductive isolation because it's very, very possible that over time, the island flies are going to mate near the bananas while the mainland are going to remain near their mangoes. And so the mainland and island flies would stop mating with each other because the mating culture around the specific type of fruit is going to change. Thereby, the gene flow or the sharing of their genes between the two groups of fruit flies is going to stop until their genes are so different that they stop reproducing altogether, which will create a completely new species of flies, the flies that were found on the island. So, some other mechanisms of evolution include coevolution. When we think of coevolution, it is essentially joint evolution. So, it's evolution of two or more species based on how they influence each other. So the evolution of one species can influence the evolution of another. And this generally happens when there's a symbiotic relationship or a predator-prey relationship. When we think of symbiotic relationship, usually it's mutualistic. So for example, with pollinators, angiosperms or flowering plants actually co-evolve with pollinators. So bugs and animals that help to pollinate flowers. So that pollen or how the system of pollen works and how it sticks to the stigma and how it can be moved and brushed off by wind and attached to the fur or the fuzzy part of a bumblebee, it actually co-evolved with these organisms. Or for example, with this moth. Or this moth here, we can see it has a very, very long tongue, is able to stick its tongue into this long flower that has nectar all the way in the back, which will allow this specific pollinator to pollinate this specific plant. So another example is with a garter snake and a rough-skinned newt. So the snake is going to catch the newt, and the newt has developed chemicals which are very poisonous to the snake. Some snakes have actually developed a mutation to be resistant to this poison, so they can still actually eat the newt. So they have both evolved over time to try to counteract each other's new traits. Mimicry is just that, to mimic something. We know that evolution has happened or that coevolution has happened when we see organisms that are actually fairly they're not dangerous, but they copy the traits of some organisms that are actually very dangerous or very poisonous. So when organisms have evolved to share common characteristics, this adaptation can increase its fitness. So for example, the eastern coral snake is extremely venomous, while the scarlet king snake is not. But just by passing by, looking at that band pattern, a predator, such as a hawk that likes to eat snakes, it might confuse the scarlet king snake for the eastern coral snake. Or another example down here with these frogs, this frog would be considered poisonous while this one would be considered non-poisonous. But they are so similar, it is very difficult to tell the difference. Or even with the viceroy butterfly and monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are actually fairly poisonous to a lot of other animals that try to eat them, like birds. The viceroy butterfly looks extremely similar to the monarch butterfly, almost identical, which will help to ward off a lot of organisms that would want to try to eat it or prey on it. So here are some other examples of some organisms that are mimicking. So here we can actually see that these are wings. So these wings almost look like faces of other organisms, like an owl or a rodent, which could help ward off any other organisms that might try to eat it. Or even here, we have this bug that has camouflaged itself to look just like a leaf. Or here, we have our grasshopper or this insect that is in the brush and is blending in almost perfectly. And this last one, we actually have this moth, which is blended in with the rest of these leaves, and it's almost difficult to see it. And finally, we have the environment. The environment is ultimately what decides which adaptations are favorable and which are not. An organism cannot choose for itself. It's all about the environment. The environment will select for or against specific traits to determine if it is most beneficial for that environment. So, just to make sure that we are clear, organisms do not get to choose successful traits. Only the environment does. The environment selects for or against your traits. So some examples of evolution include antibiotic resistance and pesticide resistance. And antibiotic resistance, which we've already talked about previously this semester, is when bacteria become resistant to the drugs that we use, which are the antibiotics. Some bacteria can develop a mutation that make them resistant to the antibiotic, meaning they won't die, they'll continue to survive, and will continue to reproduce. If bacteria reproduce while they contain that antibiotic resistance, their offspring will also have that same resistance, and that antibiotic will no longer work, making it more difficult to get rid of that bacteria. And the same thing is with pesticide resistance. Pesticides are chemicals that are used to kill insects that harm our crops. Occasionally, these insects will develop a resistance to that pesticide and it will no longer work, meaning that they will survive, reproduce, and pass this adaptation on to their offspring. When this happens, farmers are essentially wasting money as they're spraying pesticides all over crops and they're still being damaged by these insects. So now a lot of our crops have pesticides all over them, and the insects are still surviving, reproducing, and still damaging crops. And so another example is with malaria. Malaria is caused by a parasite that enters the blood as a result of a bite from a mosquito. Malaria is controlled by killing that mosquito population with pesticides such as DDT, but there are DDT resistant mosquitoes that can survive and pass on those traits. So there are many insects where this is true, which makes the population extremely hard to control. So finally, let's wrap up with an old EOC question. So it asks, why do chemical pesticides lose their effectiveness over the years? The answer should be B. The insect populations develop resistance to them. If you have any questions about any of this information, please make sure to write it down and bring it to class tomorrow.